The world's best physios don't just treat, they coach. Welcome to the Physio Coach Podcast. This episode is sponsored by Jane app. Jane is a practice management platform that helps clinicians like you and I spend less time on admin and more time caring for people. From online booking and scheduling to notes, reminders and billing, Jane is designed to reduce the day-to-day load on busy clinicians like us. After a few years of running Better Physio Group, we wanted to level up our practice management system. 10 minutes into the demo call and I was convinced. Use code PhysioCoach2MO, that's PhysioCoach2MO, to get 2 months free. Sign up to the demo and see it for yourself. This podcast is a product of Better Physio Group, provider of physio and PT services in central London, helping people in pain, suffering with injury to feel better and live better. There's physio and then there's better physio. We are currently experiencing an epidemic of bone stress injuries within our clinics. The talk is that we are seeing more and more because we're better at picking it up. The talk is that there are apps that are pushing people too hard. The talk is that there are people under fueling. The talk is that we are training in a way that we're not designed to train. I think there's lots of factors involved here, all of which we're going to discuss going forwards in this episode. We've had running physios on this podcast before, and given the nature of the current climate of more people running, more people getting injured, there seems to be an addendum needed to those conversations. And we're going to start today's episode on bone stress injuries. That does seem to be the hot topic in the physio world related to running right now. So I'm going to introduce Ben Lombard, a running specialist physiotherapist. He's going to explore his own experiences. So Ben is a superb runner, and he'll give you his credibility stats in a minute, and I'm sure you'll be impressed as I was. But the main thing here is his experience as a physio that's helping these runners. So welcome to the show, Ben. Thanks for coming in. Tell us a bit about you, your journey as a physio and a runner, but also your thoughts on the current bone stress epidemic that we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charlie, for having me today. I really appreciate being invited on. You've had some really excellent guests, and I've listened to lots of your shows. So I feel very honoured and privileged to be here today. I'm a physiotherapist. I work for myself in North London, and I have a practice in the city. I primarily deal with runners, whether they're injured or whether they're trying to improve their performance. So I try to mix and blend the biomechanics, the coaching side of things, and the physiotherapy, strength and conditioning, rehab protocols. I have been dealing with runners more so over the last 4 or 5 years, which coincided with when I actually started picking up running myself. I entered the New York Marathon ballot on a whim in 2019 and managed to get in, which I now feel is very lucky given the state of the ballot entries for the major marathons today. And then I was hooked. Wasn't a runner before. I was standard sports all my life, CrossFit at the time. Thought I'd give this running a go and found it incredibly addictive. And as I've done more and more of it, I have, as you say, become better and better at it. And through achieving good times and treating more runners and getting more recognized in that area, that I've decided that actually is an area that I really wanted to specialize in and niche down in. And sort of the better you become at a run, better you become at dealing with these people, and the better you become at the sport, you get a little bit more sort of authority or notoriety in the space. But yeah, the bone stress injury pandemic, as you say, or epidemic, as you say, is real. It's something that we are picking up a lot more. I think since the start of the year, I have seen nearly 20, and that is definitely more than I saw last year. Whether I have gotten more, accurate at picking them up and recognizing the symptoms, or whether people are recognizing the symptoms themselves. But I think a big part of that problem is that they've always been there. Running as a sport has changed in many ways in terms of how we train and the access to the tools that we have to train, but running itself has been there for years and years, decades, and people have always been getting bone stress injuries. And I think that the mass participation numbers that we are seeing, how much they have grown, we're not seeing necessarily a larger percentage of bone stress injuries. We're just seeing loads more running injuries, full stop. And that means that you're seeing and coming across loads more bone stress injuries as a result of that.
We mentioned off air about the London Marathon, the recent news released by the London Marathon. We are, as this episode is released, on the eve of that event.
Yeah.
And they are seriously considering a 2-day event going forwards, which makes sense. They're year on year oversubscribed by, is it 30 times, something like that? 30 times?
1.1 million applicants for the ballot,
Yeah.
50,000 spaces in total. Many of those are already distributed out to elites and to charity spaces. So the numbers when I applied for New York were 180,000 applicants for 15,000 spaces, 65,000 runners. So the percentage chance of you picking up one of those is tiny, but that shows you the growth. 180,000 applicants to 1.1 million applicants for the ballot in 6 years. That is exponential.
It's one of the positives of COVID, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
That forced people to rethink the way they train and get out and exercise more, but also just to rethink their lifestyles. There's this accelerated loneliness and deconditioning that people were suffering with that to some degree was alleviated by getting out and running. There wasn't much else we could do around that time. So we've got COVID to thank for that.
Yeah. But also, COVID was a respiratory disease, right? So yeah, people were wanting loneliness, running with friends and doing lots of things. But I also think there was also an element of people thinking, how do I protect myself against a respiratory disorder? Actually increasing my cardiovascular health and increasing, running is seen as one of those fitness aerobic building exercises. I think in the slightly older population, definitely, it's my patient population, they wanted to run because they wanted to be fitter, feel fitter, be more aerobically capable. And, now that's sort of being backed up with the longevity stats on VO2 max being a big predictor for longevity. And I think that's also furthering a little bit of that desire to want to run and do cardiovascular exercise, which I think is really positive.
I think ultimately bang for buck is so powerful in running for getting that cardiovascular hit, right? I've spent years doing other cardiovascular training, sports, cycling, but nothing gets the spike in cardiovascular stimulus like running does, really, does it?
So convenient as well. If you're busy clinic day and you want to go for a 30 to 40 minute piece of exercise, by the time you've got to the gym and got changed and done your workout and got changed and showered, it's a long time where, you pop your trainers on, do a loop of somewhere, and then you've had it, you can do it nice and easy, or you can, as I say, get your cardiovascular hit in different ways, and it's just super convenient.
And in a way, therein lies the problem, because it's so easy to do, and it's so easy to get a real high load in your body that people don't always appreciate the recovery need.
No.
So what we're talking about here is the mix between an overload injury versus an under recovery injury. And I've shifted my language to people a lot in the last five or so years, that people need to think of these more as under recovery, because the load itself is not necessarily the problem. You just need to give it sufficient time to recover, and that's what's not happening in our current climate. And I mean, you've quite rightly explained that it may not just be about there being more of them going on, but even if there isn't, let's educate in a way that helps people see a solution to the increase in these in total, not just about if there's a more prevalence, but if there's actually just more happening. Let's try and get that message across.
I think people also need to understand that bone is a dynamic tissue. People see bone as like a structural thing. It's unchanging. It's what it is. And I think that is a bit of a misconception. When you exercise, like with your muscles, you damage them, you get micro tears and you get the repair. Bone is the same. As you are loading that bone, you cause micro damage and then the bone remodels. And if the bone breakdown exceeds the body's ability to remodel that bone, you're not going to get the adaptation you then need for running. So, if you are running and then you're causing some breakdown and then you're not having adequate recovery between that and you're not getting the remodeling, you're then running again the next day, the next day, the next day. You end up in an almost like a negative feedback loop of damage, under recover, damage, under recover. And that's where you end up with these bone stresses becoming more and more problematic and ultimately then leading to fracture.
And this is multifactorial, right? What we're speaking about it in the context of bones, but it's not just the bones that are impacted by this under recovery situation. So what other things start to happen in the body when people are under recovering?
So many things. You can look at many different systems. Hormonal health begins to decline. You have differences in like your mood, your mental health. If you're under recovered, fundamentally, your body's not getting what it needs. And I once heard someone use quite a clever analogy of your body effectively, uses or goes into low battery mode, right? So when your phone goes into low power mode, you don't have access to all the apps that you might want at the time. And your body does a similar thing. For example, we see a lot of women, or I see a lot of women who are under recovered or over exercising, who then begin to have menstrual irregularities. And actually for men, it may not be as immediately obvious, but low libido, loss of morning erections, like these are the questions that they're uncomfortable to ask sometimes, especially depending on the patient that you've got. But I think it's really important to try and educate people of some of the signs, because you can put a lot of these things down to stress, busy work, relationship stress. I'm feeling tired, feeling a bit rubbish, haven't eaten very well. But actually the body keeps the score. And actually you can sort of see that once you start to peel back some of the layers and you realize that this person's been unmotivated for a while, their performance is declining, or maybe they're not achieving what they should be given the training that they're doing, and they've got some of these sort of bigger red flags of loss of libido and menstrual irregularities. Those are the key signs that people really need to kind of be aware of, and especially as clinicians, you need to get comfortable asking some of those perhaps embarrassing but really important questions.
What tends to happen, I sense, is that people who aren't that in tune with their body suddenly become really passionate about something that requires being in tune with your body, and they just look around them. They're looking on Instagram, they're looking at their mates, they're looking at Strava, they're looking at all these comparative tools and saying, well, that person's running every day. They look in great shape. They're running some amazing times. Tell you what, I'll do that.
Yeah.
Or they're running a bit and then they run a bit more and they get fitter and they think, I just need to keep running and then I'm going to get fitter. And to some degree, there's a truth to that, because the cardiovascular system adapts really fast and you can get that benefit. But then we've got these other systems that don't adapt quite so fast, tendons and bones, that can't handle that ramp up. Yeah. And then you start to get these injuries, right?
Absolutely. That's exactly it. Tissue remodeling as a process happens when, anything gets loaded, anything gets stressed, anything will then rebuild as long as you give it the time to, but they do it at different rates. Muscles are super fast, super vascularized, loads of blood, really good. Tendons, less so than a muscle, more so than a bone. So, they will be different. Cartilage as well. Cartilage needs compression to reinforce itself and get stronger, but too much of it and you start to get the breakdown more than it can recover from can be terrible, as cartilage doesn't have the best healing capacity. But I think you hit something really important with the social media side of things as well. Since COVID, definitely, social media grows every year. The amount of Instagram and TikTok and all these pages that are out there with run influencers or running influencers, exactly as you say, running every day, going to events, and they've cracked the code, because they've understood that the more events they do, the better engagement, or more to the point, the better engagement comes from when you do something like an event. And I see it on my own page. If I go and run a race, like I just ran Cambridge Half and I did fairly well, the engagement I get from doing something like that is massive. Whereas if I put a post out that I think is really good quality advice around, tissue capacity and loading and the importance of strength training, it'll get some good work. It'll get some good attention engagement, but comparatively to the, wow, he's done something really cool or does something really amazing, it's so different. So then you have people who are following multiple influencers and seeing that they're doing a race in the spring, a race in the summer, a marathon in September, and then they've got another one in the diary for maybe the December, and they see that as normal. But those people might not have a full-time job, or they might be being paid by brands to kind of do those events, and they obviously want the engagement, they want the money, and it can easily lead to things like overtraining. And some of the influencers that I follow and really, find some of them really inspirational, really admirable for how good they are at the sport that I love. The Valencia Marathon was an interesting one, end of December. So one of the last big ones in the calendar year. A couple of the people that I followed, at least 4 of them pulled out, not even for injury, but because they were just burnt out. And they'd either done Berlin in September, London in April, and a couple of races dotted across. So people are just looking at these race calendars that are full, and because he can do it or she can do it, I can do that. But you can't understand that, they don't lead the same life as you, so you can't adapt from the same level of stress if your life is completely different to theirs.
Yeah, the concept of priorities just helps us understand that there's only so many priorities you can have in your life, and if you are trying to prioritize work, family time, exercise, friends, it doesn't. You cannot have them all as priorities. So you have to periodize your life in a way, don't you? I've come to realize that recently, that there are different times where I can push hard with my work, different times where I'll push hard with my training, and then make sure I really lean in and maximize my family time when I can drop down all of that. And there's always a sacrifice you're going to make in one direction or another. And because we're not full-time athletes,
No.
you can't plan like a full-time athlete. You can't behave like one. You have to appreciate that there are knock-on effects there, and compromises that you have to make regarding training and recovery and all that stuff. So when you're saying about even these people who are these rumfluencers, these people that are literally paid to do it, and they're burning out, what hope do the rest of us have?
Absolutely. And I've seen that massively. I think I got injured last year before Manchester Marathon, and I was obviously training a little bit like a lunatic. I'd set myself an outlandish goal, but the problems, multifaceted as they were, yes, I was overtraining and exceeded my capacity for load. That's the sort of biological, obvious tissue issue. But I also had a 2-year-old or a 1-year-old that wasn't sleeping, and I was doing one of those countdowns on social media, 12 weeks to the race, 10 weeks to the race, didn't get down to 1 week to the race, got injured. And I think that there are, you say, well, if this person can do it, why can't I? But actually, I had too many plates spinning, and the one that crashed down was my body.
What was the injury?
Do you know what? I was going to bring this up later because it's really fascinating in terms of pain. The injury was never diagnosed. So I thought I had a early grade stress response in my neck of femur because the pain I was having was very much impact related groin sports pain. I didn't do the race, but I had planned to go on holiday afterwards. So that a couple of weeks had passed and I ended up getting an MRI about 5 weeks to 6 weeks after the injury. And I went for a little test jog on the day of the MRI to kind of see how it was like to kind of, just so I could be a bit more clear with the consultant. I had the MRI. I saw the image. I didn't get the report until the next morning. But I saw the image and my neck of femur was clear and identical to the other side. I ran the next morning with no pain.
But the day of, you had pain?
Yep.
That's just, that's right there and then. I mean, you listened to the episode we've just released with Simon Cabot talking about the how pain is not always what we imagine, and that just backs that up entirely, doesn't it? Yeah. Pain is so much more than the structures. There is psychological connotations, emotional connotations, social connotations.
Yes.
All of that makes sense in your situation. There's a good chance that there was some bone stress, right? It wasn't to the level that was picked up radiographically, but there's a good chance that you had some level of bone stress there because you're a physio, you kind of know what it feels like. But 5 weeks was enough for it to settle down because it wasn't that bad.
Yeah.
You weren't able to run a race, but it was the right thing to then get it checked out. But the psychological and social baggage that was attached to that then gives you this insight. It's a bit like the nail through the boot story, right?
Great story.
As soon as they took the boot off and had the scan and you realised there was nothing there, everything went away.
But it was mind-boggling because you have it quite a lot with patients, right? You have it at the moment. It's marathon season, right? So getting a lot of marathon patients, and they might feel a flare-up of something, and you talk to them, and then they run the next day and it's gone. But that emotional baggage is heavy. The psychological, the social aspects of I put this pressure on myself to do this thing. I'm so disappointed I didn't get there. What am I? I'm going to lose loads of followers. And actually, incidentally, I lost loads of followers because I didn't do that race. I mean, I'm grown up enough to not care about that, but at the time I was a bit annoyed.
But the subconscious did notice that.
Yeah.
Subconscious that's really evolutionarily attached to not losing their tribe. You lost a chunk of your tribe because of a thing. Of course, that's then going to affect the biopsychosocial pain that you are experiencing. Luckily, the evidence of there not being anything on the scan was enough to then shift it. But it just shows you that stuff was, the wider context was really, really important to that.
And what was really interesting at the time was I had this plan of booking a revenge marathon for October or November to kind of reinstate my self confidence and just I don't know, to kind of, again, because I was certainly concerned at the time about the sort of social implications through my, physio getting injured doesn't look good, especially one that likes running and likes to treat runners. But again, I was able to kind of bring myself off the ledge and actually be like, that would make things worse.
Yeah.
But it's, physios are not always the best patients. Yeah. I find myself, I'm not.
Look, I know that feeling well, because I've had a couple of surgeries in my time, and I've always joked to people about, God, yeah, it's bad reputation for me, isn't it? I'm a physio that needs surgery. I put a lot of my ankle surgery content online just because I thought it was interesting. But there is still that feeling of, God, did I fail myself there? Did I fail that? And in the end, no. I mean, we're all humans, of course. It's silly, but it does. I understand that feeling entirely.
I think it strengthened me as a physio in the sense that I have a personal story to draw upon. Like, you have to remember, your audience listening to this and watching this, they know a lot of stuff, right? So they're trained, they've seen loads of people, they might specialize in runners themselves, they might know loads, they might know a lot more than I do, but actually your patient population don't. And you need to be able to have that person understand what you mean without just throwing jargon and data and numbers at them. And I think that really is strongly done with, like, it's good communication, right? But being able to give them an example of a story that they can empathize with, or you know, and it helps to convey a message that's really important. So the injuries that I've had in the past, whenever I get a patient who has them, I almost look forward to telling them that I've had it.
Yeah.
Like, I've had it and I don't have it anymore, and this is what I did, and you know, I know what it feels like. And they, whether they do trust you more or whether they, you know, it's almost like it's validation a little bit, like, oh yeah, it does hurt.
N=1 is sometimes the most powerful testimony you can give to that person in front of you, when they just need to feel like someone gets them.
Yep. Especially when you then go on to prove that you can do good things after. Yeah. So these injuries that I've had, and then to run a 1:12 half marathon is pretty, you know, shows that I've got over the problem. Yeah. And I'm back on my feet.
I strongly believe I'm a better ankle and back physio for the journeys that I've been on. Yeah. And as a result, I can connect with those people really directly. I've got a guy at the moment who's considering spinal surgery for radiculopathy, and he's been really leaning on my experience of that to help him guide his decision. And I can't make the decision for him, but I can just explain my story and say to him, oh yeah, by the way, that was 13 years ago. Yeah. I can still lift well over 100 kilos off the ground, and I do it regularly, and I run as much as I want, and I played rugby for a few seasons after that. Yeah. So of course, that's my story, and your story might be different. But just consider that, there are positives to consider here, not just
absolutely
the potential negatives.
And I think it helps with the fact that, you know, you have recognition, you know, you've treated it thousands of times with other people but yourself, but the fear avoidance you get, I think that's a really big one of, you know, clients or patients who have surgery for radiculopathy, and then, you know, they are afraid to bend their back, or they hear something bad, you never round your back again, all this other stuff. And actually you need to, like, coax out the fear avoidance and kind of get them back onto their feet doing heavy and cool things again. And I think, as you say, personal experience, when you're like, well, look at me, I can do all these things, and I've had what you're having, it helps them connect with you, as you say. I think it's really valuable.
And given that we're on the topic of me and my radiculopathy that is, on the whole healed, let's go into the Gait analysis that we did together a month or so ago. And so you'll find it on our Instagram pages, so you can see the video, the snapshot anyway. Yeah. So I was quite curious in this assessment that you've developed, and it's a really great service. So I had a belt wrapped around me. It has an accelerometer within it, and that accelerometer is able to measure. First of all, we did some stuff on the floor, just doing some jump tests and hop tests. And although not as much data as force plates, it wasn't far off. It's missing a few things because it can't measure force, but it's got some really great insights into that, and it confirmed a few things that I already knew, which was that my jump height's quite good. I'm strong and quite powerful off the ground, but what I'm not so good at is being springy. Yeah. So the repeated hop test was pretty average. That just confirmed to me the kind of stuff I need to be focusing on in the gym, and perhaps the stuff I don't need to do as much of. Yeah. So I have been doing my homework, Ben. So I've been doing some hops, and then the most insight really came on the treadmill. So this accelerometer then starts to measure stiffness, stability, asymmetries, stride length, cadence, all these things that we're starting to learn is useful. And you can talk us through this stuff in a minute. But what was most interesting is that my left radiculopathy was still showing up with a pelvic tilt on my left heel strike. Yeah. So as a result of that, my cadence was low because it was taking almost too much time to then recorrect the hip drop, the pelvic drop. And I've been really working on stabilizing through my left hip since then. And although I do have to be conscious about it still, my cadence has gone up 7 or 8 an average of 7 or 8 per run. And I can feel my glute on the left tiring a bit more, which is good.
Yeah, it's
great. And it's starting to help me then drive a bit more through my right foot, which is my ankle surgery. So I was quite surprised at how that was still there, because I definitely don't feel that. Until you'd show me the data and show me the video, I definitely didn't feel that. That wasn't my experience of running.
Yeah, I think that's often the case. People don't. I'll put someone through an analysis and they'll be surprised to see the footage. And I think so. The sensor I use is by a company called Run Easy. They're really good. The move sensor, as you say, is a gyroscope with an accelerometer, and it's very sensitive. It's been validated against force plates for the jump tests. It's, as you say, it doesn't measure force, it measures acceleration in G's of force. But it's also not segmental, right? So it's taking a measurement at the sacrum, and then it is looking at sort of lateral instability. It's looking at sort of impact magnitude, duration, how long you're taking that force. It does look at things like your contact time, your flight time. It gives you some information around the duty factor, how long you're spending on the floor. And you can make lots of assumptions. And for the jump test, it's really good at looking at things like your reactivity, your spring efficiency, and your reactive strength index. But I think what's interesting to pick up on from yours is that, yes, you had that left-sided contralateral hip drop on the right side where you land on your left leg, but there isn't much research to suggest that just by strengthening that lateral hip or the stabilizers is going to correct that. And that's where things like your neuromuscular control and timing and sequencing become really important. So, you could do all of the lateral hip, external rotation, abduction work that you wanted to, but your ground contact time is somewhere between 170 and 300 milliseconds. That is too fast for you to consciously produce a contraction. So that's why that reactive strength is really key. And that's where things like plyometrics become really important to develop that reactive strength, because these are happening too quickly for you to decide whether you do or don't contract. And especially if you're doing it for an extended period of time. As you get towards the end of a marathon, something that we'll talk about later, I'm sure, is durability. People run out of durability, and that's when things start to hurt and break down in that final 10K, because their force production slows and the force production reduces, and they lose that sort of reactive springiness. And I think that is quite an undertrained area. Often, we'll probably talk about plyometrics, but people think, and again, you see online strength training for this. Strength training is really important, and it is really important. It increases your tissue capacity, right? So, I sort of explain to people that tissue capacity and load is sort of like a cup of water. Your cup is your capacity and your water is your load. And, put too much load through your cup and it'll overflow. So if you want if you want to be able to take on more water or take on more load, you need a bigger cup. And you do that with strength training and various different types of strength training that are specific to running. You've got your force production is really key for taking on more force to deal with the joint reaction forces that go through the body. And the rate of force production is really important for fast, powerful contractions. Then your reactive strength for the springiness. And I think that people get stuck in the mindset of like, okay, well, I'll do my 3x15 of X, Y, and Z. And actually, if you're doing 15 repetitions of something, as a percentage of your 1 rep max is probably too low. So you're not really developing that much force as you're doing that training. It's not doing you no good. It's just not doing you as much. You're leaving stuff on the table, basically. So, for you, someone who produces loads of explosive force, you produce lots of force and you produce it quickly in a concentric fashion, actually, as you say, having you on the treadmill and looking at the data of the increased contact time or increased duty factor on that left side, the contralateral hip drop, and then pairing that with the reactive strength being lower, that directs your rehab really nicely. And kind of, as you say, if I was a physio that just said you need more strength, then I'm retesting you, but why are you still hip dropping?
Yeah, it wouldn't make a difference. My intuition is that the left glute has relatively similar strength metrics to the right glute. But I do plenty of split stance and single leg stuff where I can't really feel a difference when I've got time to do it. But what I definitely recognized is the lack of speed or lack of ability to just engage it in a way that supports running, and that's then feeding into what you're saying there. And what I've started to play around with is I've been going into some rabbit holes around predictive processing for chronic pain, and it almost feels like my predictive processing model for running has been almost dysfunctional since my radiculopathy.
Yes.
So it's it's been inhibited for so long by the pain and the radiculopathy that when I got back to running, I just learned another way of doing it.
Yeah.
And it was a good enough compensation strategy to just get by. But as I'm starting to run a bit more and think a bit more about performance and injury prevention in the future, it's suddenly something I need to then correct. I need to create these errors. So what I've been doing whilst I've been running, even though you're saying you can't consciously do it, if I just keep thinking of it and making it conscious, there are times when it starts to feel better. It's like, I think that's it. And then I'm teaching that process, that unconscious, subconscious system that this is the way I want it to feel.
Yeah. So,
and it starts to feel like I can not try quite so hard. And there are times where it feels a bit more like a flow. And this is like a month in now. So it's probably, 10, 15 runs.
Yeah. But that in itself, there is a recent systematic review, 2024-ish, that looked at almost outthinking exhaustion. And it was exactly that, basically, like when you are running actively, like verbally, internally cueing that drive, step. And that's something that I definitely use it. Towards the end of the half marathon I did the other day, you can feel yourself sinking into the floor as you're losing that spring reactive strength. You feel you're having to like push off the floor rather than like just hitting it and going. And the cue that I kept using in my head was think. I kept like, I could feel it particularly on one of my legs, I can't remember which one, and I'd just kind of like say the word think, and I would feel that speed up of contraction. And a lot of it is to do with neuromuscular control. You've got your cortical inhibition, you've got your cortical excitation, especially around a joint, you get arthrogenic pain inhibition, and you need to redistribute and reorganize the amount of excitation and the amount of inhibition that you're getting. And that neuromuscular control is really important at different stages of rehab. Early on it's quite about just maximal contraction and isometric work, but then as you move through it, that I really think that neuromuscular coordination comes from things like plyometrics, but also strides. Getting some people running their nice easy run, then finishing with 4 or 5 30-yard dashes, getting you really pushing, increasing that force production, increasing the timing, reducing your ground contact time, reducing your duty factor, increasing your flight time by pushing harder and pushing further. I think that has quite a big carryover to the neuromuscular control that you need for running.
I've often said that the first stage in rehab is we've got to build up the capacity, or let's say, look, firstly calming it down, right? It's the old Greg Lehman, you've got to calm shit down, then build shit back up again. The kind of the 2-pillar approach to physio, which I say that a lot in sessions. What we do is relatively straightforward. We do these 2 things, but at the end of that capacity bit where you've built stuff back up again, you often have to relearn how to use the capacity, and that's that neuromuscular coordination. I think that's something that gets missed a lot of the time, and that's where the details do start to matter. I think a lot of the time technique isn't that important in strength building. There's a big margin of safety for lots of different things. But sometimes when it comes to this end stage, for the right person, it's worth getting into the weeds and really working at it, having some kind of feedback mechanism, whether it is something fancy like your gadget or whether it is something a little more rudimentary like taking a video or just getting in front of a mirror. That stuff could be really beneficial.
I always film. I actually don't think doing one is worth it. I think you can film in isolation. I think that can be really useful, but then you have no data on the force produced or how things are actually moving from a sort of very small controlled area. And same with this thing. Like, I love this belt and I find it very useful, and often the things do correlate, but you do, I think, need to film side, back, front if you can, so you can really take a look at all the different things. But I think one thing that you mentioned again is like you throughout your radiculopathy, you sort of, as you return to running, you sort of developed a pattern that's comfortable for you. And running gait is very much that. It's like people pick the movement pattern that feels smoothest to them. And with gait re-education, like, I don't re-educate someone's gait if they're not in pain. Right? Even if they've got a hip drop or something that's like not causing them any discomfort, they don't necessarily need to be changed. Running is about economy and actually trying to like become more efficient. But they've done studies on like what actually increases economy, and the biggest predictor specifically in gait retraining, because most of it was around training load and strength and other kind of outside retraining things, was vertical oscillation. If you're too bouncy and you're going up too high and you're coming down and you're having to absorb a lot of force, that reduces a lot of your sort of efficiency. And running is essentially about ground reaction force, right? So like 2 to 3 times your body weight roughly goes through your body, and specifically at joints it's different. Your hip might be 4 to 5, your knee might be 5 to 6, your ankle could be anywhere between like 6 and 12 times your body weight as a peak force contraction. That's shared between the joints in your foot and ankle and knee and hip and muscles and ligaments and tendons. So it's not, you don't need to be able to lift those times your body weight. But I think feed forward motor control is also something that is quite interesting. Your ground contact time, let's call it 200 milliseconds when you're running really fast. You've got initial contact, you've got mid stance, you've got push off, all in that 200 milliseconds. So the speeds at which each of them are different. Initial contact is going to be more eccentric load, mid stance is a bit more isometric, push off is a bit more concentric as you're pushing a horizontal ground reaction force, and the eccentric at the beginning is a bit more of a vertical ground reaction force, but they all have to be so fast that feed forward motor control is really important from your brain. And that's like when you put your foot down, your calf is already contracting.
It's the prediction.
Yeah, exactly what you're just saying. That prediction model that you're talking about is a learned pattern, and is something that you can practice and get better at by doing the thing.
Yeah. There's the other thing that I had noticed when I focused just on that one thing of engaging my glute and learning how to get it timed right, I suppose, is that yes, my cadence increased almost by accident, and then my vertical oscillation changed. I did become a flatter runner. I wasn't bouncing as much.
Yeah.
You said that some people are naturally a bit bouncy. You said you're quite a bouncy runner, but it was interesting that without even trying to change that one cue.
Yep.
Did seem to correct 3 or 4 different things, and let's use correct in inverted commas here. Is that quite rightly that there are all sorts of different ways that you can run, and it's perfectly healthy. I think the reason it was interesting to me is because it was related to that radiculopathy that at the time I didn't need to change, because I was going back to lots of bilateral strength work. I went back to rugby where I was more interested in becoming strong and powerful and just sprinting, and we weren't doing gait analysis then, so it wouldn't have been picked up. But I'm just becoming more intrigued by that stuff, and then actually I do want to change that, and I'm not interested in becoming an elite runner, but I like the fact that I'm developing the skill and learning how to run a bit more economically.
Yeah, I think there's lots of things that you can and can't change. I think you should always pick 1, maybe 2 things at a time to change. Change too many things and it's a nightmare. But also it's not, gait analysis isn't actually always about changing stuff. It's maybe actually just understanding a little bit about how you run. So you can be a heel striker, you can be a toe runner, you can be midfoot, you can have a small overstride. Like all of these things are fine. But understanding, like if you are a toe or a forefoot runner, your calf complex is going to take on a bit more, right? Or if you are a heel-based runner, your knee and your hip might take on a little bit more. And it's not that you have to change those things, but it might direct where you put more time and effort into strengthening. And then you can obviously play around with changing these things. There's nothing wrong. But I think that if you are making changes to someone's gait, it should be because of a pain, or it's like a strategy that a compensation pattern or a load redistribution pattern that they have subconsciously picked up, or it might be something to do with a economy feeling of ease. I had a good example yesterday with someone who her running style was absolutely fine, and she was generally, her metrics were quite good, but she's really stiff in her thoracic spine, and she swings her arms across her body. Right, so again, there was like some limited rotation in her thoracic spine, and it was doing some weird things with her pelvis, and she was getting a circumduction of her left hip, and her right shoulder just wasn't really turning. And the one cue that we changed, because her cadence was great, she wasn't bouncy, her strength metrics were good, she just changed a little bit about how the direction of her arm swing. And it's quite interesting to see how you can have small knockdown effects of something that's actually relatively easy. And then I ask her, like, how does that feel? Does that feel easy? Does it feel natural? Does it feel smooth? And she was pleasantly surprising, which she was like, yeah, it felt much, much better. It felt like she could run a lot faster. She said, I felt like I kept touching the front of the bar on the treadmill, and obviously the speeds kept the same, and the effort level's the same, the cadence is the same, but the efficiency, her cost per step is down, so she's pushing a bit harder. It's fascinating to see those small changes.
And we're just going to take a short break. We'll be back very soon. We have a special break interlude for the sponsor today, because we're quite fortunate that Ben also uses Jane app. So we had a conversation earlier to prep for the episode, and I mentioned that I use Jane, and you've since shifted to using Jane app for your practice management software. So yeah, tell us about your experience so far.
It's been overwhelmingly positive. Being able to manage the 2 locations that I have on one system, the easy invoicing, easy payment system, it's really clean, it's super user friendly, and I am very, very glad that I made the switch. It's made my life a lot more streamlined and convenient. So thank you for the recommendation.
Yeah, and that's a lucky coincidence today, because we didn't plan this, but I think Jane will appreciate the extra vote of confidence from you. So thanks, Ben. Back to the episode. Let's bring it back to bone stress here. Actually, you mentioned about the different hotspots for impact loads depending on your gait. So if someone's coming in with a history of bone stress of some sort, are you going to be considering that in a different context for those people?
Yeah, I'll definitely, once they are recovered enough to start running, I would like to get them on a gait analysis to kind of see how it is that they land. There are a few things that are associated with increased risk of some bone stresses. Things like peak tibial acceleration can be related to things like tibial stress, and that can also be, maybe due to weaknesses through things like the soleus and the gastroc, and even the intrinsic muscles within the foot as well. But it depends a little bit about where the bone stress is. If it's in the femur, or if it's in the femur shaft, it's in the femoral neck versus the tibia versus the fib versus the foot. They're all going to be slightly different. I'm going to look at them slightly differently, but I still think above gait analysis, if I'm honest, that would be the very last thing I'm looking at. It's so much, there are so many levers to pull and to check on. Training history is huge. Recovery, like we said, sleep, fueling, even, obviously all the menstrual cycle and bits and pieces like that. But I think that hugely again, this is totally anecdotal, but I think that if, social media has portrayed this sort of like high protein, low carb, let's get shredded vibe for quite a long time. And I think that a lot of people have hang-ups of that. It's protein bars, your protein in your water, right? And I think that as a result of that, a lot of people are under carbohydrated. They will eat a lot. Maybe their calories are net neutral and the calories are okay, but the amount of carbohydrates, again, that just massively affects recovery. And I think it's something that's seen more and more, especially with the sort of red S cohort.
It makes sense, because if you are running for some kind of performance goal, there's a good chance that some of your training is going to be a really high intensity. And your body just is not capable of producing energy fast enough through fats and proteins. No. It requires carbohydrates and ideally sugars in those moments that it can really quickly break down and create energy from. And in this world where, low carb is a strategy for health, some people argue quite strongly for that. And even in a runner, they might not even be consciously low carb. They're just normal carb, but they might be needing high carb in those certain days. I've heard people talk about periodizing nutrition.
That was me.
Yeah. So thinking about, this was a big day for me, I better eat loads of carbohydrates. And because my history was rugby and I've always tried to put on mass, and I've always struggled. But I've always been thinking about, I need more carbohydrates. Yeah. Becoming a runner wasn't that difficult for me on that sense, because I was always just thinking, I ran today, I'll eat loads of carbohydrates and I'll just crack on. Whereas for some people who maybe have come from a social media influenced aesthetic, they're running for aesthetic reasons, that they're dual training and dieting, and that combination is a really dangerous thing for them.
I completely agree. You get a lot of people, there are loads of influencers who have then become running influencers. They might have been fitness influencers in the gym before, as you say, working for aesthetics and whatever it is, and then they bring themselves onto running. But I definitely fell short of that. I had a colleague or a patient of mine who's a sports nutritionist, and I was just communicating with her about how I was feeling around certain things with my training and just like recovery, and she was like, keep a food diary. So I did for about a week, and I was pretty honest with it. I was very honest with it, and I sent it in. I thought I was like, okay. She looked at my carbohydrates and was like, what's wrong with you? Like, how can you, why you're eating so low carbohydrate? I was down at something like maybe 150 to 200 maximum, but not through any sort of conscious dietary. And just like your fat's really high, proteins are, your net calories are fine, but you are just like, you're almost half the amount of carbohydrate that you should be given your weight and the amount of exercise that you do. And I made those changes about 2 or 3 months ago, and it's crazy, the difference in terms of feeling, performance and recovery.
Feeling is really important here as well, because what I try and encourage people to do is become really intuitive and really introspective about what's going on in their body. One of the most powerful things is waking up in the morning, like, how do you feel? Like, do you feel like you could do the run that's programmed in or not? And because my sports science degree seems to influence me more and more these days, more so than my physio degree. Most of my physio learning was after my degree, but my sports science degree, I never did a job in that, but I seem to be leaning on it more and more. And it's just that kind of awareness, I suppose, that's helpful. But that's why this conversation is good, so people can then take something from it and increase that ability to just consider what they feel like. Right, we're becoming so disconnected with our bodies at times that people aren't even sure. They're following this program blindly and going, oh, it says do this, so I'll go out and do it, and then they try and do it, and their body's absolutely fucked, so and they just can't handle it.
That's why that brings really nicely onto the AI training tools, right? So AI training tools, I'm sure you have an opinion that they're brilliant for so many things, right? They are accessible. There's huge community involved around it. It's getting more and more people active. It's affordable compared to, one-to-one coaching and all these sorts of things. And they work quite well. They work by creating a personalization. So they kind of get some data on you, your personal best, and the amount of times that you want to run. And then it picks up data points from the runs that you put in because it's connected to your watch, right? So it sees your heart rate, sees how fast you've gone from the plan that it has generated you. And it goes, okay, well, that you've hit those paces, let's crack on. Or it goes, okay, well, I can see, this was a zone 2 run and your heart rate was 170. I think that's a bit fast for you. We're going to auto adjust you down. And there are some safety features where you can say, like, I'm injured. Pause me. But there isn't that sort of, people miss the starts of feeling bad. Yeah. You often feel amazing before you get injured because you've pushed something and you've reached a new personal best. So you go, great, I'll push further. And actually you needed time to actually back off from that personal best and absorb that. And that is, again, that poor picking up, that poor signaling or disconnection, like you say, is how people miss an injury for one run, miss it maybe for another, and then all of a sudden, this is too much of a problem now.
Well, in the end, we're always playing with risk. It's either high risk or low risk. It's never zero risk. So even the strongest and fittest people that follow the right loading strategies, get everything right, recover correctly, they get injured too, just at a lower percentage, a lower rate. So you're always playing with that risk. So sometimes people say, but I've been training like this for years. Nothing happened then. It's like, hey, you got lucky. And actually the training error was there all along. You just got away with it. And that's sometimes what happens with these people online as well, right? People are doing these things online. It's like, bloody hell, how can you do it? I worked with Josh Patterson and he ran 76 marathons in 76 days. There was a huge chunk of luck in that, right? He could have at any point had an injury that would have meant that he couldn't run.
Absolutely.
Right? He had a few of them along the way, but he could have actually had one that meant he couldn't run. But in the end, he got lucky and he trained very well for it. He's a very healthy, fit guy, so a very strong chap. So he had big load capacity. He did his best with recovery. But he got lucky. And
you also can't train for that. 71 marathons in 71 days, or 72.
76.
76,
But this is what we said, actually. We said, we're going to have to accept that you are going to start this not fit enough to do it.
Absolutely.
And hope for the best, that you essentially train yourself to being able to run marathons every day.
It's wild. It's phenomenal. I remember it very well. I remember watching it and feeling like inspired by the fact that they can do that. And I think it's amazing, when people do those things, and that's the power of social media. Is very, very inspiring and raised lots of money and great cause. Invited people out to come and join, a huge sense of community. But we do then see off the back of that other people doing similar sorts of things as a sort of like, whether it's a tip of the hat to Josh doing that, which is amazing, or whether they just think that it's something that they can do as well. And for some, Josh had you, which is obviously an amazing pocket device to have to kind of keep you healthy. Other people, they don't have you in the back pocket being like, hang on, mate, you need to kind of watch this.
But I think that's what we're going to get to here, right? Is that, you need to find someone that you can speak to in times where you're not sure.
Yeah.
Because what these apps are great at is this off the shelf for a normal person,
Yeah.
right? Or a kind of a range of normal people. But if you're an anomaly in either direction, something in your life happens that you can't put into this device. Just so happens that, I don't know, here's an example, right? I run with a heart rate strap because I like the data to be accurate, and I think that it becomes better that way. I always got annoyed with my wrist not quite feeling right, my wrist monitor. A couple of times I've ran and I've forgotten it, and then the data is then wrong on my watch, which means it's feeding into my training plan incorrectly.
It's annoying.
And I have to then auto adjust that in my head, and my VO2 max went up the other day when it shouldn't have done, and then my next training session was too aggressive because I'd forgotten my chest strap.
Right.
So I was able to figure that out whilst I was looking at it and whilst I was in the session.
Yeah.
But like this
is the danger of data.
Yeah.
Because actually, many people I talk to them, I see they're wearing their watch, and I go, tell me a little bit about how you've enjoyed wearing your watch. And then I'll always ask, do you have a heart rate? Do you have an armband or a chest strap? Much more accurate data. And a lot of them do, but a lot of them don't. And I'm sitting there then having to sort of explain to them, not to like poo-poo on their device, but I'm like, the data is a little bit inaccurate, especially on the wrist. It's important that you understand that, because if you are doing anything heart rate based, you have to understand that there's quite a large degree of error there, and that can put you at risk of either undertraining and not performing, which is less of a problem, or overtraining and running yourself into misery.
And that misery often comes in the form of injuries. Tell us through some of the common running injuries, some of the conversations you might have, some of the tools you have to help someone recover from those.
The ones I've seen most commonly this year, Achilles tendinopathies, loads and loads of them. IT band syndrome, again, lots and lots of it. And that one's particularly fun because they've now, the consensus is that it's much more of a compression syndrome rather than a friction syndrome. And I think, I quite enjoy explaining that sort of understanding that, the fat pad, highly innervated, gets irritated, and, helping them understand that biomechanics, problem at your knee is not always a problem at your knee. I quite like those ones. With an Achilles, yes, there are things up the chain that can be heavily involved, but like with the IT band's quite easy to show someone and convince them that there are proximal hip issues or maybe distal foot and ankle related issues, as well as muscles around the knee that aren't kind of doing so well. And it's quite a nice one to kind of go back through their sort of training load and the boom and bust volume. So I enjoy that one a lot. What
kind of stuff do you find you give out for those ITBs? What's a fairly classic type of program that you'd give to someone for that?
I will start them with that there's always going to be some lateral hip stability, and again, neuromuscular control stuff. So I'll work them from some sort of hip abduction and external rotation based exercises, and I'll progress that through to some sort of exercise that I love is like a kneeling plank with a hip abduction, something that's stabilizing underside, dynamic on the top. I think it's great, gets a bit of trunk involvement. Just love it. Some sort of like standing clamshell, again, working on one leg being stable, one leg being dynamic.
With the band,
of course. Yeah, all of that stuff, like resisted. But again, it's very important to move away from bands into like real life, bridging the gap between rehab and strength. When that has calmed down, then it is all about, for me, making sure that the hip, knee, ankle are working nicely together. Big old fan of the Bulgarian split lunge, the staggered stance, RDLs, but loading them properly, single leg presses. Like I like people in the gym with them. And then as soon as that strength is I'm seeing there's getting some improvement, then I'll start looking at my plyometrics. I'll look at sort of the bilaterals on the spot, singles on the spot. Then I'll look at sort of changing directions, lateral hopping, forward, broad jumping, bounding, stuff like that, before I'll put them on a return to run. And the key with return to run, I find this time and time again, people get over the injury, and then they fail the return to run. And I saw something yesterday I thought was awesome. I think it's David Gray. He said, the victory has defeated you, right? And what he means by what I took from that, whether I've butchered it or not, is the pain goes away too quick sometimes. So someone's pain goes away and they haven't had enough time to make any physiological change. So they're still as weak as they were. They're just less sensitive because maybe they've done a little bit less running and they've calmed down. So they go, see you later, off on my run, problem happens again. And then they come back, and then there's that sort of like cycle of like, I wish your pain hadn't gone away so quick because you still had a little bit more to do.
I call it a victim of your own success.
Yeah.
So, and it happens all the time, is that sometimes you need you almost want the pain to hang around just enough to get them through all of the rehab.
Exactly.
and yeah, it happens. We're not just talking about running injuries here, but injuries in general.
Totally.
Is that pain is a wonderful motivator for them to do what you want them to do.
Absolutely. Exactly.
And the moment they're pain-free, they just fall off the wagon a little bit. They lose that habit. And that's the bit where I've got to work really hard as a physio.
That's the
I've
priorities.
really got to coach them. That's the coaching bit again. It's like I've really got to coach them into understanding the value. That's where metrics comes in. And I fully agree, like there's a kickback again. So we just over measuring stuff. And I think sometimes maybe, but this is where the metrics are really helpful because you can just return them to that number and say, look, that number's not where it needs to be yet.
Yep.
And your risk is going up if we're not going to address that specific number because it's so relevant for your problem.
Yeah, I think data is really key for that. It's actually like I think at the beginning of rehab, data is not that important because you're inhibited, right? So actually, it makes people feel a bit bad. And I learned that the hard way. I had someone who had a degenerative knee tear in his meniscus, and I tested his quad strength left and right, and it was something like 1,000% difference because he could barely produce the force. And I could see in that moment, luckily he took it really well and has used that as a motivator, but I could see there was a split moment where I was like, he's either going to cry or find this motivating. Luckily it was the motivation, but I think testing becomes really key when you are trying to get towards the final stages of rehab, like with your ACLs, right? Those quads need to be damn strong and they need to be balanced. Otherwise you're running the risk of imbalance related problems and stiffness, really not having the stiffness in the leg and the other issues that come alongside that. So yeah, I think testing the whole way through sometimes is a little bit performative, but I think it needs to be used judiciously in that sort of like, this is what we're testing you because we need to know where you're at, but it's a snapshot, but I want to see where you are now, then I want to see where you are down there.
I saw something which reminded me of this fact that Achilles tendinopathy or generally tendinopathies respond to lots of different types of loading. There's not necessarily a one size works over another, one method that works over another. I'm definitely in the heavy loading part of that, and even though the evidence is there, it just suits my way of practicing. So that's where I go. Have you got anything that you use in particular for that, or anything that you sense works well for your caseload?
I have had a lot of really good experience with it. It is quite outdated, but the isometric, eccentric, plyometric model of just like linear-ish progression. I don't see it as a linear progression as in I do one, then the other, then the other. It's more of like a layered effect, but it is something that has worked for me time and time again. That sort of heavy isometric mid-portion or mid-range work to kind of get the analgesic effect and start to build the strength and capacity without putting the tendon under compression or aggravating the problem. And then obviously the heavier eccentric work I think is really key, and then the plyometrics, but sort of, if you could imagine just layering them in. But it's all dose dependent, right? I think strength and tendinopathies specifically, they aren't tendinitises anymore. There's not the same sort of like inflammatory markers that you would sort of get in a normal sort of inflamed thing, but there is also neural components of it, and that's why for me I think the isometric stuff is useful at the start, because I think there is particular use around neuromuscular coordination and control when I'm trying to get something more cortical excitation, less cortical inhibition. For me, that is why I quite like using isometrics at the beginning. It also, I think, is good for adherence because they tend to be slightly less painful.
Yeah, and let's move up the chain a little bit. So we've spoken a lot about bone stress. We've spoken about Achilles tendinopathy, some ITB. Let's go PFJ. So tell me about PFJs with runners.
Patellofemoral joint pain is definitely the most common thing out there. Again, one of those things that gait retraining can be useful for. So often I'll see with patellofemoral joint pain, there's some proximal hip issues for sure. There is some mismatch between the hamstring and the quad. Maybe the VMO is a little bit underdeveloped or just generally not firing as well as it could be. Maybe even some calf weakness. But again, when you put them on a treadmill, you often see that they are an overstrider, and often an overstride with a heel strike. So you'll see that that takes the foot away from the calf ankle complex and puts it towards the hip knee axis and just puts the braking force back, right? So if you're thinking about as you're running and as you're landing, that contact, if your heel's out in front and you're pushing back through it, the PFJ just gets overloaded and is is one of those things that responds really nicely to cadence optimization, right? So, there are studies on optimal cadence, but they are, again, also outdated because there are many runners who fall either side of them. There are elite runners in the 160s and there are elite runners in the 190s, but, people still recommend that sort of 170 to 180. But what I find quite useful is seeing where someone is at and then seeing if keeping the speed constant on a treadmill, if I increase that between 5 and 10%, how can I change that? How does that feel for the runner? How does that affect, if you're thinking about speed equals cadence times your stride length, if the speed's the same and I've increased the cadence, the stride length has had to come down. So then I'm pulling that foot underneath the body, giving it a chance to be less of a braking force.
What else would you use for? Because I did my dissertation on PFPS, so I remember going through all the stuff around. It was around the time when hip was really fashionable to use, like loads of hip strengthening for PFPS, and they were starting to move away from the VMO stuff.
Yeah.
But in recent years in my career, I see more and more individuals that have terrible VMO contractions, and the VMO fires right up with a single leg knee extension in inner range. So I just can't understand how it can't be a factor here, right?
Yeah.
To me, it seems clear that people benefit really well by firing up their VMO for some kind of patellofemoral joint, or even just functional, right? Most of function is in inner range knee flexion. We do all this deep knee and hip flexion work with squats and leg press, but running is an inner range activity.
Yeah.
And the easiest way to load in a range is a knee extension.
Yep.
And you ask someone where they feel it, they're pointing to their VMO.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So I just don't understand why. Why are they struggling with the data here when it just seems so obvious to me?
But finding your way in, that's a classic problem with lots of these problems, is finding the appropriate load. And often you'll see what's given, because VMO is great for terminal knee extension, right? So you'll get someone doing a banded terminal knee extension where they are just like squeezing back. But I think what's also quite common with PFPS as well, you get a bit of fat pad irritation, and that doesn't like terminal knee extension.
Yeah.
So actually you then have to work out what you're dealing with, whether it is purely PFPS and the fat pad is fine, in which case terminal knee extension exercise or your leg extensions, they will do the trick. But if you're battling a slightly more complex issue and you've got your fat pad that's irritated, and then also your VMO under firing the irritated, then I would look a bit more proximal hip, hamstring, and avoiding terminal knee extension. But that calf, I still think that's really important.
And then quads eccentrics as well, I tend to find in those situations, because they're probably jamming down into terminal knee extension without the control, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, to me, that's where palpation comes into its own. You've got to be really sure with your palpation techniques. Does that fat pad sensitivity disappear under knee flexion? You get the knee flexing, fat pad falls back, you're now not pressing on the fat pad anymore. The pain's got away. When you're really working around the patella, is that where their pain is on that surface, compressing down through it? And is there pain in terminal knee extension or mid-range in the squat? That is there that arc of pain that you might get with a patellofemoral versus that moment of pain on the knee extension.
And I think something that I quite like to do is I'll manually lift the patella. Yeah. Right. And then I'll get them to
old school,
fully
love
extend. I just do it with my hand, yoink it up. And and if that works, it's really probably one of the only things I use tape for.
Yeah, it's my favourite K-tape use, is that patella lift.
Yeah.
Is that just offload the fat pad,
pull it up,
lift it up, does it help? And I would say a big chunk of people feel a lot better, and some pain goes away entirely.
Instantly as well. I've had people get off the table and look at you as if you've done something magical. Okay, great.
It's like you're just wiping your shoulder, right? Just rubbing your shoulder. Yes. Mic drop moment as physio. So every now and again we get those. You either push on a spot that takes their pain away, or you get that little magic taping technique. It doesn't happen very often, but it's fun and to enjoy it while it lasts. But I agree. I do still use K-tape for that, and it's very easy to self-teach. It often stays on for several days, so they can have pain relief.
Unless they're hairy.
And then you again shave the leg, and then
absolutely.
So I do teach it all the time. And if it doesn't work, it's like nothing lost. It's like
absolutely. You come off from the shower, then you're fine.
Yeah. All right. Well, patellofemoral pain ticked off, I guess, to some degree there. A little whistle stop tour here, but good to just get some of the hot spots. What other running related injuries do you see?
Hip impingements, very common. Greater trochanter GTPS. Have had a few hip dysplasias. They're harder. Generally, I find the subjective is massively important with that. But if we go with hip impingements first, they tend to be like, again, I think a subjective is really key, because you can have an impinged hip, you can have restriction around the hip, a loss of hip extension, and you can get impingements within it that cause, some of those symptoms. But those true sort of like really achy, nasty hips that, you run and, you go to sit down afterwards in a meeting and your hip's like throbbing and aching, and, your patient officer says they have to sit with their leg out straight in the meeting. So I think for those, I think a good subjective is quite important with that.
Help me understand this with regards to running, because hip impingements most commonly felt in deep hip flexion angles, right? It's that classic, you're on the leg press and they're like, oh, my hip flexor's tight. And then you do your testing. I mean, you wouldn't do it this order, but, and obviously they've got this kind of clear FAI type situation, this cam or pincer situation. But with running, so I've always thought, well, they're nowhere near where that hip impingement will take place. So what do you think the mechanisms are for hip impingement being flared up by running?
I think there's a poor femoral control, especially in adduction and internal rotation. So, you might have someone who has a crossover gait or someone with a big contralateral hip drop, and actually then that puts them into a position of internal rotation and adduction. And I think that can create irritation and inflammation around that anterior capsule. And if that gets significant enough, I think that can irritate the hip joint badly. Weakness through the adductors as well. Again, like people very, very often, you see a lot of the time, it's your glutes, it's your weakness in your glutes, but it's, everything is agonist, antagonist, right? So like there might be some weakness in the glutes, but there's obviously probably going to be some weakness through the adductors too. But I think the mechanism that I probably see as well, think when you're overstriding, there's more hip flexion. There's more trunk sort of forward lean. Yeah, people who are quite heavy, and actually I think it's that braking force is quite a lot through the hip. It's between 4 or 5 times your body weight goes through your hip joint. And if the muscular system and the tendons around it aren't sufficiently coping with that, and you have some force coming through the hip backwards, and you have the adduction of the hip or the leg across the femur across the body, I think that can create enough compression and inflammation that will lead to hips being sore. And then obviously you do your tests, you do your cluster of tests, you FADIR and a couple of other bits and pieces, and if you suspect it, send it for an MRI.
And what do you use for strength testing? What's your go-to strength testing in a clinic exam?
I have a handheld dynamometer from a company who I can't remember. Strength testing. So I do use the handheld dynamometer. I do functional strength, so like capacity testing and stuff like that. I might even ask them to, if I'm in clinic, I might get them to go on a leg press machine and sort of test 10 rep maxes and things like that. Yeah. But if I don't have time for all of those things, I might ask them to do it. I might give them here's a list of things I want you to do. I want you to score yourself here and maybe test it twice on each side. So they're the sort of things that I would use for testing strength specifically. What about you?
Yeah, we're quite lucky here that we've got the Dynamo. So the Dynamo is pretty good for the handheld stuff. We've also got the force frame, which I've started to use a lot more for hip flexion, hip adduction, abduction. I think it's a really good setup for that.
Yeah.
I do also use capacity testing a lot. Certainly in a first session where I'm just trying to get a snapshot, there's a good chance I'm not going to get round to some of the more advanced testing. I just want to quickly see ballpark, how many single leg sit stands can you do, how many single leg calf raises can you do, how many single leg elevated bridges can you do. So that's given me quad, hamstring, glute, calf in 3 relatively quick tests.
And that's the hundreds score. You roughly 25 is a good number for each of those. But again, I think that those tests are useful, but they don't provide you with how much force. They're good in endurance, right? 25 repetitions of something is tiring. It's not, in my mind, it's testing your ability of like the force that you can produce. So I like your force. What's the machine you were just
force frame?
The force frame, I think, looks really amazing because it's a bit more standardized. But when I use something like a handheld dynamometer, I try to ensure the most repeatable and accurate measures I can get, which is very hard to do. But I think that I'm less looking for the raw score specifically. I'm looking for the differences side to side with those, and or a particularly low number relative to their body weight and things like that. Because I don't think I am accurate. I'm not always the device isn't in the right position, always the patient isn't in the same position. So because there's no true standardization, I think doing those tests is useful and retesting them is useful, but it's not as accurate as it would appear compared to the frame anyway.
Yeah, and I think sometimes what you're really trying to get across to the person is some clarity about why, because that's what they'll ask you. Why has this come on? Why on this side and not the other side? And there's, as much as I know roughly what I'm going to give this person before I test, the numbers are often for them to help them see, to help them understand. So I don't mind that some of the testing is not going to be 100% research grade accurate. And I even say this to people sometimes, like, I'm just looking to get a good idea of your capacity in general in these places, and then we can measure it over time and see that change. But I kind of already know roughly where I've seen enough cases now to know I'm probably going to give this, and this, and it's just a bit of extra detail to help sometimes me understand, but often them understand. Where the data is really important, I think, is the ones that aren't going to plan.
Yes.
It's like, we're 3 or 4 sessions in, we need to take a closer look here. Why is that not following the path I wanted it to take? And then I might get a bit more detail about some other stuff, and that's where force plates, force frame, I think, really comes into its own.
That's also for you and for them.
Yeah, exactly.
So they get that I need that. If something's not going to plan, I need to reassess as to what have I missed, right? But I think also it's really important to make your get for buy-in, patient buy-in. And I think nowadays there are, the tracking tools or the programming tools that we were talking about before the show that we use, the one that I use, and I'm sure yours does too, has a tracking metric. I can check adherence, and I can chat function, and it gives me a reminder if they are less than 50% adherent and stuff like that. And I think that retesting sometimes for those people who have been less adherent is key, because then they go, I've dropped the ball a tiny bit. I need to.
I say at the start, it's like, these numbers are accountability for us both. Yeah. So it's making sure that you're doing your homework, and it's also making sure I'm giving you the right program. Because if you're doing the work and you're not getting better, that's my fault. If I've given you the work and you're not doing it, then that's your fault. Yeah. And we have a little play around with that. And it's like, and everyone understands accountability these days, or at least most of the people coming in do.
Yeah.
So I agree. I think the numbers can really help with that buy-in and that accountability as well.
And accountability generally is important in so many, like obviously in the rehab side of things, but that's another part of the reason why I think the AI tool stuff the running tools are really useful, because it provides that as well. I think a lot of people get injured with running because of training errors, and that is likely because they have done too much too soon or whatever. And there used to be that sort of 10% rule, don't increase your weekly mileage by 10, but that's now changed, and it's much more now focused around the single distance increases. So if within a month you've increased your distance by 10 to 15, 20%, your rate of injury increases up by 134%, I think is the stat. It's a big number anyway. And, when you have someone who's left to their own device just on a piece of paper, they might skip a few runs and try and do their long run on the weekend. But if they've not done much running at all, and they've skipped a long run here and they've skipped something here, and then they go and try and do 30K because the race is coming up here, I think having accountability of like, hey man, you've missed a few workouts, that sort of thing can help avoid some of those obvious training errors. Yeah,
what I found recently with my runs is that it keeps correct. I'm supposed to be running. I say supposed to. My program is auto saying 5 runs, and I know I'm not going to get 5 runs a week, so I know that I'm probably going to get 2 or 3 runs. So I can look at the program at the start of the week, and it'll say, it'll give me whatever it's going to say. But if I then miss a run, it does auto correct that. That's cool. And it's telling me that, just do a recovery run today, or actually, because you've had an extra recovery day, you could do a more aggressive run. You could do a threshold run today. Yeah. It happened yesterday, and I ended up doing a pretty tough, like 3x8 interval threshold. And I was able to do it actually. Yeah. Whereas when I looked at it the day before it had recalibrated, it was telling me it was just going to be a recovery run.
But that's where some of the watches are fantastic, right? Like I know you use Garmin, and they've got their program function seems really good. But having all that data on your wrist, I think, is also a really good thing for. It's a bit of a self-fulfilling thing, I think sometimes people check it too much, and then it can influence how they feel, and that's not always the best thing. But I think one metric that I think is quite useful, and I don't claim to be an expert in understanding it, but like the HRV, overnight HRV, is absolutely one of the metrics that I very closely feel associative to how the score that I get. And I actually, so much so that I genuinely try not to check it until the evening or the afternoon, because I can tell very quickly. Like I'll wake up, especially if I've had broken sleep and all this other stuff, if Max doesn't sleep. And I feel like data like that can be really useful when you're looking, if you're managing your own training stress and you've got HRVs through the floor and you've got a big fat interval session, that's not a good idea.
And what I used to wear the Whoop, and it was really accurate for that. And I will challenge anyone to have a big boozy night and their HRV not be affected. Right? We know that alcohol is one of the biggest stressors it's ultimately a strong poison that would be illegal if it wasn't for the fact that it's been so institutionalized into our culture. It is terrible for that. It is it just crashes through the floor. Yeah. And there's no way of cheating it. Unfortunately, it's really quite bad for your HRV. It takes several days to recover. So I think it's a really valuable tool to check on your training readiness. And my watch is pretty good at being kind of picking up that training readiness and telling me where I'm at. One thing I've noticed, and this is quite an interesting recent development for me. I used to upload my runs to Strava all the time and didn't really think anything of it. Since having the Garmin watch program it and track my performance there, that's become enough for me. And I almost overnight kind of reflected, I haven't uploaded a run to Strava for about 3 months. It's like, I wonder why I'm doing that. It's like,
validation.
Weird. Yeah, I'm clearly not looking for that validation anymore. I'm enjoying the validation of just looking at the stats on my watch and on my phone. So, look, I don't have a problem with people doing it. I think it's a pretty cool way of just keeping track of people. But I just weirdly just kind of suddenly went, I'm not even uploading that anymore.
Which I think is great. I actually have a separate one. When I was training last year, I had one that I used to post on my social media all the time, to see how I'm training. As trashy as that sounds, and after I got injured and I restarted running, I was like, that's not good for me. I don't think I need people checking in on how I run, and I don't post the sort of runs that I do anymore. And I have a private one that's linked already to my watch, but I use the in-watch sort of feedback, because I think it gives me more data anyway.
Yeah. I think we should finish on having a bit of fun here about super shoes. So I've got a pair of super shoes, some Saucony Endorphin Pros, and they only come out on race days. I might do one run before the race just to remind myself what they feel like. And in that run, it's normally an easy run, and my easy run is often like 20 seconds a kilometre faster at the same effort. They do seriously improve speed. And I did 4 PBs across the 5K, 10K, half marathon the year before my surgery, so a couple of years ago. And as much as my training went really well and I was drinking a bit less, I was in a good place fitness-wise, I wouldn't be surprised if some of that data is influenced by wearing carbon-plated shoes. So, give us your insights into these super shoes.
I think they are brilliant, and they absolutely help. They are studied quite intensively to show the benefit, especially, so like they've studied it across all different speeds. And from about 4:30 minutes per kilometre and under, so running faster than that, the speed is the benefit is very, very consistent. And you might have heard the sort of one of the first leading brands was Nike with their Next Percent, and there's meant to give you a 4% increase in efficiency and economy, and that's sort of like based off really elite runners that study was done by. So then they've become more and more popular, and it is true to say that it's a point of diminishing returns. So from 4:30 under, well worth it. As you get sort of towards the sort of 5:30, 6:37 minutes a kilometre, the benefit becomes less consistent and it becomes less of a benefit because the force and reactivity of your stride is less. So you're not actually getting the propulsion that the carbon plate is designed to do. It will also be affected by your weight, and it'll be affected by how where you strike on the foot. If you are someone who is a real heavy heel striker, the point of like inflection, or that maximum point of propulsion, is further forward in the foot, or it's more towards the midfoot. So you're not even claiming all the benefit that the shoe provides. So I think it can be quite interesting to see someone rock up to their local park run in a 280-pound pair of shoes and jog round at the back. However, there is not a no benefit. There is a benefit, but I think there comes a point at which where maybe someone doesn't require a shoe that is inherently a little bit less stable, because typically they have a lot of cushioning that's quite spongy, and that is a little bit less stable, especially when you're running at slower speeds with a slower cadence and a longer duty factor, so more time per stride with your foot on the floor. And actually there will be a point at which a different type of shoe is more beneficial for that person. But if someone wants to feel part of the super shoe club, I would always recommend buying a pair, because as you say, it will rip time off you, and they're brilliant for that.
Yeah, I'm. The other thing is that they wear out faster, right? So that's that. I had it in my head as like, if I'm going to spend all this money on a pair of shoes, I want to make sure that I get my money's worth and save it for race day. Because I think it's in like 200, 300 kilometers, whereas on average it's like 1,000 kilometers for a normal shoe.
They vary, but yeah, I mean, you do have probably sort of under 300 kilometers is kind of classic, but I have exactly the same. I bought a new pair just before Cambridge. I've worn it for those. I won't wear them again until I run Milan.
Yeah.
And that's all they're doing.
Yeah, the nice thing is that there's a good chance you'll be listening to this very podcast whilst you're running Milan, because it'll be released at the same time. So yeah, we've got race season coming up, so lots of people probably tuning in to try and learn a bit about running and running injuries, hopefully to prevent, not to solve. But lots of physios listening in who are going to need to be armed with this very stuff here. What just to motivate you on that run that we're talking to you now, Ben? What time are you aiming for on your marathon coming up?
I've not actually said it out loud. I don't think. I would love 2:38.
2:38. That's super specific.
I would love to under 2:40. If I get 2:39.59, I'll be delighted. If I get anything under 2:45, I'll be happy. I'd love to secure a good for age at London.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. So good luck, Ben. Keep going. You've got this until the end.
Thanks.
Yeah. I've got. I just booked a 10K. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do this year, just coming out of my kind of rehab year from my ankle. 10K felt right. So I'm going to be, maybe I'll listen to this on my upcoming 10K in May. So I'm going to do Victoria Park 10K. I'm aiming for 44 minutes, which is around my PB time. So
fantastic.
That'd be nice for me. Feeling good. I've got no injuries at the moment. It sounds like you're feeling in a good place as well. I've got some gait retraining that I've been working on. And I think really, what's interesting coming out of this conversation is that you mentioned this at some point when we were talking before, that how gait retraining can be over and underused. And what I like about that phrase is it really encapsulates the point of this, is that not everyone needs it. So people that are not injured don't need it. People not recovering from injuries, they probably don't need it. Leave it alone. But for the people who do need it, people don't have enough information, don't really know how to apply it, perhaps don't have the tech in order to make it objective. So hopefully people can go through this and really take some key information. For the listeners out there that want to learn a bit more about you and about this, where should they go?
Best place is to find me on Instagram, Ben Lombard Physiotherapy. I try to post as much as I can around sort of gait retraining and sort of wider context of tissue capacity training, load, strength, and training management. Because as you say, it's overused, underused. If someone's not in pain and doesn't need it, then it can just be fun. But it's just part of your assessment toolbox, right? If you want to look at someone's gait, you can, but there are many things that you can do that you can, that you don't have to use gait retraining and gait analysis. But it's just something that I particularly enjoy using, and I think my patients like it too. Yeah,
and you're now running a service for running assessment, the injured and non-injured runner. So I think if anyone has patients in London or outside of London but near enough to commute, I think it'd be a worthy thing for them to come and look at if you're struggling with some of this stuff, because I think it's a really good service. You're a listener, Ben, so you'll know this part of the show. So we always ask our listeners, what does better never ends mean to you? And this ultimately comes from a very personal place, because this is my why. So I like to hear other people's versions of it, because it kind of, I hear some different.
Yeah, I think
bits.
It's such a clean phrase. Better never ends. It's like it's almost too obvious, so that the constant evolution of you doing stuff. But better never ends to me doesn't just mean getting better at a singular thing. I think better never ends is a much wider term of kind of periodizing and getting better at maybe. Better never ends, getting better at doing my training, getting better at more family time, getting better at my work, and actually just always having something that's getting better, rather than focusing on trying to make something specifically getting better forever and ever and ever, and you're reaching a bottleneck and potentially coming to bridges. If you've had a good go and you've hit your marathon time of 2:38, that's not what I'm going to be focusing on getting better next year. It's going to be more time with my family, got another baby coming in July, like that'll be my better for the rest of that year. And then hopefully when I get a bit more free time back, I'll see to something else.
I think that's great. Yeah. Thanks so much for that, Ben. Hopefully hear more from you, and good luck. Final good luck message for Ben whilst he's currently running his marathon right now, and good luck to all the runners out there who probably got their aim races and times they're aiming for as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've made it this far, that probably means you've enjoyed the show. Please leave us a review and subscribe to the show on whichever platform you use. I've been told that this stuff really does help us to reach more people like you. And if you are someone in charge of things at work, book a demo call with Jane to see it for yourself. Use code PhysioCoach2MO to get 2 months free. To stay up to date, follow us on Instagram at BetterNeverEnds or on YouTube, the Physio Coach Podcast. This podcast is a product of Better Physio Group, provider of physio and PT services in central London, helping people in pain, suffering with injury to feel better and live better. There's physio, and then there's better physio.